back at St. Anselm College here in New Hampshire, and we are here every 4 years thanks to our amazing Manchester partner, WMUR. And now anchor Monica Hernandez and political director Adam Sexton are joining us with questions on the minds of New Hampshire voters.
Thank you, George. It's an honor to be here in our community. We know Granite Staters are engaged, and we know there are issues that strike especially close to home here. New Hampshire has one of the highest rates of deadly overdoses in the country. In some cases, police and paramedics tell us that they are saving the same lives again and again, sometimes more than once in a single day. It's a healthcare issue, but it's also so much more. Mayor Buttigieg, you have described yourself as a moderate, but one of your policies at least goes further than some on the stage with you are willing to go. You have called for the decriminalization of all drugs. Does that include heroin, meth, and cocaine, some of the drugs that have contributed to this crisis?
No, what I've called for is that incarceration should no longer be the response to drug possession.
With all due respect, Mayor Buttigieg, on your website it says that you called for decriminalization of all drugs.
Again, what I'm calling for is that we end the use of incarceration as a response. This does not mean that it will be lawful to produce or distribute those kinds of harmful drugs. But also, as we know from the opioid crisis, some of this has been driven by companies that were acting irresponsibly with substances that were lawful. It's why in South Bend we sued those companies to hold them accountable. We've got to make sure that there is accountability for those who suppressed evidence about the addictiveness of those substances, even while we're also coming to recognize that these kinds of addiction are a medical issue, not a moral failure on the part of somebody battling that addiction. That's why medication-assisted treatment is so important. And those people who are being revived, and our own EMTs in my city have been so frustrated by the experience of reviving somebody, but then they have nowhere to go. Sometimes you get brought back with a dose of Narcan, but then your life depends on whether in the days that follow you make it until somebody can actually see you, because we have such a shortage of mental health and addiction providers in this country. We must act to change that and save lives when we do.
I want to bring this.
That's actually a really great response by Pete. I think in general, Pete's kind of shown to be himself to be a more moderate candidate on the stage. And that was also like an excellent question for the party to give him, for Democrats to ask him is what makes you different, right? Pete wants to decriminalize all drugs, and I think that's a great first step, because we have so many people in our country who are in jail for nothing other than drug possession or nonviolent offenses. I also think that it's kind of a wise move, because one of the things Joe Biden always stands up and says, but look at all these cool things Obama and I did, right? Obama, I was part of that, and Obama's so cool. But he's Pete is now kind of saying, at the end of Obama's presidency, he released all these non-violent drug offenders at the federal level. And he's basically showing, yeah, I also have that same kind of position. So all these things that Joe Biden stands up and says, oh, Obama did this and he's so cool, so I'm so cool. I think, other candidates can definitely lay claim to that too, because Obama, is not something that's exclusive, and having policies similar to Obama is not something exclusive to Joe Biden on that stage.
Question now to Mr. Yang. You've said you would decriminalize opioids, but you've also said that you would require all overdose patients to go to mandatory treatment centers for 3 days. Well, right now in New Hampshire, there aren't enough beds in treatment centers and across the country. How would you make sure treatment is available for all overdose patients? And what would you do to fill the gap in the meantime?
That's what we have to change, Monica. I've heard heartbreaking stories from families here in New Hampshire that have been destroyed, torn apart by the opiate epidemic. And you have to look at the companies that profited to the tune of tens of billions of dollars in profits of essentially blood money. As president, we will take back those profits and put them to work right here in New Hampshire, so that if you are seeking treatment, you have resources to be able to pursue it. This is not a money problem fundamentally, this is a human problem, but money cannot be the obstacle. This is something that happened on the government's watch. The government allowed this opiate epidemic to spread throughout our communities, and we have to do everything in our power to actually make sure that if you are seeking treatment, you know you're not going to be sent to jail. We have safe injection and safe consumption sites for you. If you have a family member who's struggling, you can refer them and know that they're not going to have criminal penalties as a result. There is so much about this that's endemic to what's happened throughout the country in terms of companies running amok, this hyper-corporate capitalism where if money's on one side in this country and people are on the other side, the money is winning. You can see it with the opiate epidemic. You can see it with the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel companies. This is what we must change, and that's where I'll lead as president.
Senator Klobuchar, I want to take the question to you now. As a prosecutor, you embrace tough-on-crime policies, even with drug offenders. You've also spoken many times about your father's own addiction issues, his own alcoholism, and his DUI arrests. If addiction is a disease, should people be arrested for it? And as a prosecutor, do you regret sending people with substance abuse issues to jail?
I led one of the most successful drug courts in the country in Hennepin County. And I always would say and believed, and I think my record shows this, that we weren't a business. We didn't want to see repeat customers. And if you don't want to see repeat customers, the only answer is treatment. And maybe you're referring to some of the people who were dealing big time in drugs. Yes, I felt that we should prosecute those people. But when it comes to, and you asked Mr. Yang a question, and I think we owe it to the people of New Hampshire to have had one of the biggest addiction rates in the country and death rates when it comes to opioids, to explain how we will pay for the treatment and the beds. I've been very clear about this. There's going to be a major settlement coming through, a federal settlement against all these opioid manufacturers. The evidence is overwhelming, including an email where one guy, a business guy, says to the other, they're eating them like Doritos. Just keep pumping them out. We will get a conservative estimate, $40 billion in from that settlement. We can put a 2 cents per milligram tax on opioids that brings in another $40 billion. Then you can close the hedge fund loophole. That brings in $18 billion. And just like every other policy I've proposed, and I think New Hampshire voters should care about this, I have showed how I'm going to pay for it, because I think we have someone in the White House that has told over 15,000 lies. He makes all kinds of promises. The people of New Hampshire and the people of our country deserve better. I will get this done, and it is personal for me.
Good evening, candidates. New Hampshire is a battleground not just for presidential contenders, but also for top issues, and that includes gun policy. Senator Sanders, for many voters in this Democratic primary, your allure is about consistency. When it comes to progressive issues, you've been on the right side of them for a long time. One exception is gun rights. In the 90s, when you were in Congress, you voted against background checks, and you also voted against a waiting period for purchase of a firearm. Can you explain why you oppose these things that you now support?
I can, Adam, and let me also say that in 1988, I probably lost a race for Congress, and we only have one congressperson in the whole state. Because in 1988, I said that we should ban the sale and distribution of assault weapons in this country. That was 30 years ago. Furthermore, I am very proud that today I have a D- voting record from the NRA. And under my administration, it will be the American people doing gun policy, not dictated by the NRA. But to answer your question, I come, like New Hampshire, from a very, very rural state. In Vermont, until last 2 years ago, we had virtually no gun control legislation at all, and I represented that perspective. The world has changed. In Vermont and in New Hampshire and all over this country, people are sickened by the mass shootings that we have seen and the gun violence that we have seen. The world has changed and my views have changed. And my view is right now, we need universal background checks. We end the gun show loophole. We end the so-called straw man provision. We make certain that we end the sale and distribution of assault weapons in this country. And we go further. We go further. But the bottom line is I will not be intimidated by the NRA. We're going to run the gun policy that the American people want.
Vice President Biden, you've taken a lot of heat in the
Interesting note on this. It's kind of tangential, but I think that it's kind of important just because we're in Utah. We're in our legislative session right now for Utah, right? Mm-hmm. So for 6 weeks, our state legislators will meet and work, and the rest of the year they just take it off because we're Utah and we think that's a great idea.
Oh my God.
But one of the bills that's actually being proposed is, it's a House bill. I think it's 271, but don't quote me on that. It's basically what ended up happening is it's the state legislature trying to take a lot of power on gun control and what can happen with gun control back from local level authorities. So here Bernie is talking about these important things like closing the gun show loophole, making it so that background checks have to be given at gun shows. That's something that was implemented here in Salt Lake County, actually, is the county decided that they were going to make an ordinance that if you had a gun show, everyone had to do background checks. And the reason that the legislature is making a bill is actually pushback on this. Our legislature does not, on the state level, does not want these strict gun laws. I just think that's so interesting. That's like the debate we're having in Utah right now is like whether or not these gun laws should be as strict as they are. And then you have these Democrats standing on stage talking about what an important issue it is. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Wild stuff.
This primary on these debate stages and from voters here in New Hampshire for your past positions, you've essentially asked them to look at the totality of your record and give you the benefit of the doubt. Does Senator Sanders deserve that same benefit of the doubt on guns?
Well, look, here's the deal. The biggest mistake that Bernie made, that Senator Sanders made, he voted to give the gun manufacturers, the only major industry in America, a loophole that does not allow them to be sued for the carnage they are creating. First thing I'll do as president is work to get rid of that. It's going to be hard. Think of all the thousands and thousands of people who died. And I might add, Bernie, while you were representing your constituency, an awful lot of people, they're a gun state and they've come around. In fact, all those folks in California, New York, Pennsylvania, they were getting killed by the thousands during this same period. I come from a state that's a major gun-owning state. I introduced the first assault weapons ban. I, in fact, got it passed. I'm the only guy that beat the NRA twice. While I was pushing the Brady background checks, Bernie voted 5 times against it when he was in the House. So look, the other thing is that when we have to be held accountable for the things we did. I'm the guy that set up drug courts. I set them up. I wrote it into law, and it never got funded. And also on opioids, I'm the guy who's already begun to make a down payment. In the Cures Act, I put in $1 billion to fight opioid addiction. And lastly, my time is going to be up shortly. Here's the deal. Those chief executive officers of those drug companies, they should not only be fined, they should go to jail.
Senator Warren, we'd like to go to you now.
Yeah.
Plans count for a lot. I want to ask you this question here, though. Laws can do so much. If you could change one thing about America's gun culture, what would it be?
Look, we have a gun violence problem in America. It is about the mass shootings that we hear about in our schools and that frighten us, about in theaters and in churches. It's also, though, about shootings that occur on sidewalks and in playgrounds, often in communities of color that are hit hardest. But there are no headlines over those. It's also about suicide and the increased lethality of suicide because of the availability of guns. It is also about the increased chances that it's usually a woman will die of domestic violence if she is with a violent man and a gun is in the home. We need to think of this problem not as one and done or 3 things and done. We need to think of it just like we did on auto safety. We just keep coming back. We treat it like the public health emergency that it is. But the question we should be asking ourselves is when America, across this country, including gun owners, agree in certain basic things, universal background checks, get assault weapons off the streets, why can we not even get a vote in the United States Senate? And the answer is 90%. Think about this. More than 90% of Americans agree on this. We can't get a vote in the United States Senate because it is the gun industry that continues to call the shots. Until we attack the corruption in Washington, the influence of money on campaigns and lobbying, we're not going to be able to meet our promises. And one more, until we agree that we are willing to roll back the filibuster, the gun industry is going to continue to have a veto, and we will never make the changes we make. We have to be willing to build a future that works not for a gun industry, but that works for the rest of America and protects our children.
You've got to be able to sue the gun industry.
Thank you, candidates. We're going to go back to David up there at the home.
Adam, Monica, thank you, and thanks to WMUR tonight. I want to turn to the Supreme Court, the balance on the court, and the issues before the court right now. President Trump, in just the last 24 hours, saying we've appointed 191 federal judges, 2 Supreme Court justices, keeping his campaign promise to shift the court to the right with Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. The Affordable Care Act is at the court, climate change is working its way to the court, and a major abortion case is on the docket this year. Vice President Biden, on the issue of abortion, in 2012, you said President Obama's 2 Supreme Court picks, of them, there was no litmus test. We picked people who had an open mind, did not come with an agenda. And you've said before, we both believe that we should not apply narrow litmus tests to appointees to the Supreme Court.
But
let me just ask, would you do it differently as president, Mr. Vice President? Would there be a litmus test on abortion?
If you say the rest of what I said that we're going to not appoint anyone who did not have a view that unenumerated rights existed in the Constitution. That's not a specific test. It's a generic test. And the only reason women have the right to choose is because it's determined that there's unenumerated rights coming from the 9th Amendment in the Constitution. That's what I said. And I was part of the reason why Elena Kagan, who worked for me, got on the Supreme Court. I was part of the reason why Ruth Bader Ginsburg is on the court. I was part of the reason why Sotomayor is on the court, and she swore me in. I presided, and I'm the reason why this right wasn't taken away a long time ago, because I almost single-handedly made sure that Robert Bork did not get on the court because he did not think there should be enumerated rights, unenumerated.
So let me just drill down.
Let's get that straight.
Mr. Vice President, I am aware of what you said, which is why I'm asking, would you do it differently now? Would there be a litmus test on abortion?
Yes, look, here's the deal. The litmus test on abortion relates to the fundamental value in the Constitution. A woman does have a right to choose. I would, in fact, if they rule it to be unconstitutional, I will send to the United States Congress, and it will pass, I believe, a bill that legislates Roe v. Wade adjusted by Casey. It's a woman's right to do that, period. And if you call that a litmus test, it's a litmus test. But what I was talking about in the past, so no one gets confused here, is if you read the Constitution very, very narrowly and say there are no unenumerated rights, if it doesn't say it in the Constitution, it doesn't exist. You cannot have any of the things I care about. Any of the things I care about as a progressive member of the United States Congress at the time, and as Vice President, and as a member of society.
Mr. Vice President, thank you. Senator Warren?
Look, I've lived in an America in which abortion was illegal, and rich women still got abortions. And that's what we have to remember about this. States are heading toward trying to ban abortion outright, and the Supreme Court seems headed in exactly that direction as well. If we are going to protect the people of the United States of America, and we are going to protect our rights to have dominion over our own bodies, then it's going to mean we can't simply rely on the courts. 3 out of every 4 people in America believe right now that the rule of Roe versus Wade should be the law. That means we should be pushing for a congressional solution as well. It is time to have a national law to protect the right of a woman's choice.
Senator Warren, thank you. Senator Klobuchar, I do want to come to you. Should there be a litmus test? It's an active call here tonight. I did want to come to you on this question as well.
Thank you.
Should there be a litmus test on abortion?
I would only appoint judges that would respect precedent, and one of those key precedents is Roe v. Wade. In addition, you have got to put it into law. Donald Trump, and I think it's really important to take it to him here, when he was running for election, and this is a case I will make on the debate stage against him, he actually said that he wanted to put women in jail. He then dialed it back and said, no, I want to put doctors in jail. Is it a big surprise then we're seeing states like Alabama start enacting laws that would criminalize doctors who perform abortions? It's not. And that is why it's going to be really important when you look at the overwhelming public support for funding Planned Parenthood, for making sure women have access to contraceptions, to making sure that they have a right to choose, that we make this case strongly and loudly.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you. Mayor Buttigieg, you have signaled that you'd be open to the idea of expanding the court. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg suggested leaving the court as it is, saying, quote, 9 seems to be a good number. And in fact, she said if the number of justices is increased, quote, it would make the court appear partisan. It would be one side saying, when we're in power, we're going to enlarge the number of judges to have more people who will vote the way we want them to. Is Justice Ginsburg wrong?
Well, if all we did was change the number of justices, then I agree with her that that could be the consequence. What I've called for is not only reforming the number of justices on the bench, but structural reform so that some of the justices are not appointed through a partisan process. We cannot allow the Supreme Court to continue to become one more political battlefield, as we are seeing today. And the time has come for us to think bigger, not just reforming the makeup of the court, as America, by the way, has done several times in our history, but also remember that the founders gave us the power to amend the Constitution for a reason, and we shouldn't be afraid to use it. It's not something you do lightly or quickly, but when it comes to something like Citizens United, which holds that corporations have the same political soul as people, and that spending money to influence an election is the same thing as writing an op-ed to your local paper, we need a constitutional amendment to clear that up and protect our democracy.
Mayor Buttigieg.
So you're telling me that Pete Buttigieg is coming up here saying Citizens United bad, I don't like it, when he's benefiting from Citizens United? Like, you want to know who has the right to come on this stage and say that they're going to take a stand against Citizens United? Bernie Sanders, because he doesn't take super PAC money.
Right.
Right. I mean, Yang, because he limits super PAC money. If Tulsi was on the stage, then she could say that. But, like, candidates like Pete Buttigieg who are benefiting from this system that has been created by Citizens United, who use super PACs, who have all this PAC funding, please don't come on stage and, like, act as if you care. Like, as if you did, you would fund your campaign, honestly.
Thank you. Vice President Biden, I do want to come to you on this. President Trump has said that the only reason Democrats want to expand the court is they want to try and catch up. You have called any expansion of the court a bad idea, adding, "We will live to rue that day." Do you agree with President Trump on that?
I agree with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That's who I agree with. And I agree the way to deal with Citizens United is pass a constitutional amendment I introduced 25 years ago, saying that only public money can be spent in elections, period. Not private money, not billionaires, not money from special interests, period. That's the way to amend the Constitution to deal with that. In addition to that, if in fact, look, the Democrats stood up against a man I revere, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wanted to expand the court, but they were wise enough to understand that whoever then is the majority will have the ability to abuse it, and it will lose its legitimacy. And there are three equal branches of government. It says the president shall nominate, the Senate shall dispose. The Senate shall make that decision, not the president. He can nominate. That's why it's so important. We must win back the United States Senate this time out. And that's why, as you all look at it up here in New Hampshire and around the world, around the country, you have to ask yourself, who is most likely to help get a senator elected in North Carolina, Georgia? Who can win Florida, Pennsylvania, Minnesota? Who can do that? Because you've got to be able to win those. Well, you can. I agree. But here's the point. You've got to be able to. You've got to be able to not just win, you've got to bring along a United States Senate, or this becomes moot.
Okay. Senator Sanders.
Thank you. Look, you asked a simple question. Is there a litmus test for those of us up here? For me, there is. I will never nominate any person to the Supreme Court or the federal courts in general who is not 100% pro Roe v. Wade. Number two, we have got to codify Roe v. Wade into legislation. Number three, we have to significantly expand funding for Planned Parenthood.
Mr. Steyer, I want to bring you in on this.
Like, I want specific policy. What does Bernie deliver? Specific policy.
Mm-hmm. Killing it.
Because you have claimed that when it comes to the Supreme Court, you have said Republicans have been cheating.
Sure, they've been cheating. Look, what we saw Mitch McConnell do, not just in the Supreme Court with Merrick Garland, but across the board with federal judges, was refuse to allow President Obama's picks to be considered. That's why Mr. Trump has appointed so many federal judges, because in fact, the Republicans refuse to allow President Obama to get his due. And honestly, we're sitting here talking about, do you have a litmus test? We all have the litmus test. Everybody on this row feels exactly the same way about a woman's right to choose. Everybody on this row feels exactly the same way on gun control. Every single one in this row feels the same way. There's something else going on. These Republicans are in control. They're stacking the court for a generation with young right-wing radicals. And we've watched it happen, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? That's where we are in the United States. And the question is, actually, Joe Biden's right. We have to go win a huge victory this year. And we're in trouble. And so the question is going to be, look at these people. Who can pull together the Democratic Party? And let me say this. We have not said one.
Look at these people. Not me. Like, it's so funny.
Okay.
Why are they even here?
Okay, I genuinely, this man, every time he has talked, has just said, we have to beat Trump, guys. This has to be at least, like, he's talked, what, 4 times? This is the 3rd time he said, Trump bad, Dems good. Democrats better than Trump.
Come on, guys. We like more of the same things than we think we do. Just look at these guys. Just pick one of them. Come on.
Like, he's literally, I feel like the Democratic, Party literally just lets him campaign so that he can say, Democrats good, Trump bad. Please vote Democrat. And, that's not how you win elections.
This guy clearly has a lot of money.
One word tonight about race. Not one word. Are you kidding me? We have the most diverse party. We have a very diverse country. We have a very diverse party. The heart and soul of this party is diversity, black people, Latinos, AAPI people, Native Americans, and white people. But for goodness sakes, pull it together. We're talking about something different. The question we have is, how are we getting that diverse group of people to the polls? What are we saying? Everybody on this stage feels the same way about a woman's right to choose and economic justice. The question is, how do we beat Trump? How do we take down these Republicans? And the answer is, we've got to show we can take them down on growth, job creation, the economy. We send them packing, and then we get all of this, including beating the corporation.
Mr. Steyer, thank you. The night is still young. Many questions to come, and Lindsay Davis is next.
Seriously? Is the night that young? God damn it. Literally.
I want to turn now to criminal justice. Mayor Buttigieg, under your leadership as mayor, a black resident in South Bend, Indiana, was 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white resident. Now, that racial disparity is higher than the rest of the state. In fact, it's higher than the rest of the nation, and that disparity increased in South Bend after you took office. When talking about the problem on national terms, you have called it, quote, evidence of systemic racism. But you were mayor for 8 years, so weren't you, in effect, the head of the system? And how do you explain that increase in black arrests under your leadership?
Well, the reality is, on my watch, drug arrests in South Bend were lower than the national average, and specifically to marijuana, lower than in Indiana. But there is no question that systemic racism has penetrated to every level of our system, and my city was not immune. I took a lot of heat for discussing systemic racism with my own police department, but we've got to confront the fact that there is no escaping how this is part of all of our policies. Earlier, we were talking about opioids, and thankfully, America has come to a better understanding about the fact that opioid addiction is best understood as a medical problem. But there were a lot of people, including a lot of African-American activists in my community, who have made the very good point. It's great that everybody's so enlightened about drug policy now when it comes to opioids, but where were you when it came to marijuana? Where were you when it came to the crack epidemic in the 1990s? That is one of the reasons why I am calling for us as a country to take up those reforms that end incarceration as a response to possession and make sure that we legalize marijuana, and when we do it retroactively with expungements to correct the harm done in so many cases of incarceration, disproportionately of black and brown Americans, where the incarceration did far more harm than the offense it was intended to deal with.
I want to go back to the original question, though. How do you explain the increase in black arrests in South Bend under your leadership for marijuana possession?
And again, the overall rate was lower.
No, there was an increase. The year before you were in office, it was lower. Once you became in office in 2012, that number went up. In 2018, the last year that we have a record for, that number was still up.
Yep. And one of the strategies that our community adopted was to target when there were cases where there was gun violence and gang violence, which was slaughtering so many in our community. Burying teenagers, disproportionately black teenagers. We adopted a strategy that said that drug enforcement would be targeted in cases where there was a connection to the most violent group or gang connected to a murder. These things are all connected, but that's the point. so are all of the things that need to change in order for us to prevent violence and remove the effects of systemic racism, not just from criminal justice, but from our economy, from health, from housing, and from our democracy itself.
Senator Warren, is that a substantial answer from Mayor Buttigieg?
No, it's not a substantial answer. Boom. I'm sorry, Elizabeth Warren, to take your thunder there, but he, like, okay, hold up. So the question he was asked is, can you explain why this racial disparity got worse under your leadership, right? What he should have said is, like, he should have just focused on the fact that we were arresting less people for drugs anyways, right? Saying that, yes, technically, like, the disparity was larger, but we're still arresting less black people than any other city because we have such a low incarceration rate. That's what you should be saying and focusing on. And then I feel like in the last, 30 seconds of him just saying, all of these things are connected, I think that maybe in his head there was a point somewhere, but it did not leave his mouth because all of that seemed kind of pointless to me, just because he was asked a very specific question: can you justify this disparity? Yeah, you can tie that into bigger issue. I get that's why you're here, to promote your campaign and to say, hey, my campaign is gonna work for people of every race, and that's important to say. Yeah. But he didn't even say that because he just was like, all the issues tied together. If he was trying to make it a conversation about the larger racism in our country, he didn't do that. I don't understand the point of this answer.
Yeah, he would have started by addressing the answer or the question that was asked, and then kind of as backup going into the, hey, but this is
an American issue that we need to deal with.
This is a bigger problem.
And we can do it with 1, 2, 3.
Exactly. But
I just don't understand what he was trying to say there.
Judge. No. You have to own up to the facts. And it's important to own up to the facts about how race has totally permeated our criminal justice system. For the exact same crime, study after study now shows that African Americans are more likely than whites to be detained, to be arrested, to be taken to trial, to be wrongfully convicted, and to receive racism, but not really do anything. I think the time for that is over. I'm ready to get in this fight and really make a change.
That is going to be the most memorable thing she says the entire night.
Mm-hmm. Actually, let's keep...
Yeah.
Specific policy-wise, and also just, she actually, called the party out, which I think she needs to do more often if she wants to get people like Sanders supporters to support her. And then she went in with a specific policy that not only helps address racism, but also helps to address the wider problem of student debt. And then she also explained how many million Americans it was going to affect positively. I think that's going to be the best thing that she says the entire night.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with you there, except for the fact that I'm probably one of a lot of people who have mentally checked out at this point, and it might be a little bit too late. She might have needed to come through with that
in the beginning.
Yeah, she might have needed to come through with that. So we got about 10 minutes left, and I'm kind of because I'm looking at the way this thing, they're doing their closing addresses and stuff like that. So we've got literally about 10 minutes left of questions, and ABC has not done a great job so far, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's been a little slow.
This has been super...
The questions have all been... I think that they haven't been softball questions, just at least. I don't feel like any candidate has been given super, super easy questions that are obviously just to make certain members of the Democratic stage look good. But I also think none of the questions have been the most pertinent or things that we haven't talked about before. I think that the Medicare debate, the Medicare for All debate has been happening since 6 months ago.
And we spent a lot of time on that tonight. And in my opinion, I think what would be a pertinent thing to talk about.
I think the parts that have been interesting, they talked about drug addiction and decriminalizing drugs. That was interesting. And I think it gave some of the candidates time to be very specific about what sets them apart, which was nice because I felt like a lot of it is just, as Democrats, we better than Trump, and that's been most of the debate.
Yeah.
I think that was good, and I think them talking about gun violence was good. But other than that, I haven't seen anything super on the ball.
Yeah, agreed. And not exactly like they're going to be wanting to stir up the hornet's nest and a bunch of drama, but I would really love the fact that anti-corruption is one of the things that people are running on.
Everyone on this stage is touting anti-corruption. Then call them out and say, hey,
Then
if you
let's
tout
talk
anti-corruption,
let's talk about
this in your campaign.
Yeah,
Because
let's
there's no
talk
thing that
about
any,
that.
like, every
Exactly.
politician has a career with some corruption in it.
Exactly. So, like, for me, I was really wanting to sink my teeth into things tonight. And I think that the main disappointment from the night is that these questions, even though you say they're not softball, like you said, they're
They
things that
definitely don't bring out any flaws in the candidates.
Right.
They're all meant to let the
Right.
candidate explain away a past mistake.
And we've definitely been over this before. Would I have liked to see Mayor Pete get ripped about being such a fucking disingenuous piece of shit?
Yeah,
maybe would have been awesome.
Let's talk about the Iowa caucus. Like, why didn't it
Why
they bring it up
haven't?
more?
Why is this the debate that's right before the next election, and we're not even talking at all about that? So, like I said, ABC, you got about 10 more minutes, man. Impress me.
Keep this debate going. Go ahead, Mr. Steyer.
Look, out of narrative comes politics.
And, like, this has been painful. Like, come on.
Steyer's killing me.
This has been painful with Steyer.
Policy. And we're talking about a lot of policies that affect Americans broadly and disproportionately affect black Americans or brown Americans. But what I believe is we should set up a commission on race and deal with race explicitly. Because everyone's saying we can't have rules that are different for different people, but in fact we're here because we had rules that are different for different people. I would set up a formal commission on race on day one to retell the story of the last 400 years in America of systematic racism against African Americans, not just legal discrimination, injustice, and cruelty, but also the contribution that the African American community has made to America in building it and in leading the entire country from a moral standpoint for generations and centuries. Because I believe out of narrative comes policy. We need to repair damage that's been done officially, and pretending we're all the same is not accurate. We got here a certain way. Let's talk about Jim Crow. Let's talk about Martin Luther King. Let's talk about Barbara Lee, the congresswoman from Oakland, who's one of our great leaders, and then let's figure out how to repair the damage so we can move forward together.
Okay, Steyer, yeah, and you said which candidate was that was going to do that again?
Not me. Don't worry, guys. Dem's good.
Oh, yeah.
Trump bad. Dem's good. Trump bad.
Which one was that again?
Take on that argument and also what he said about reparations.
Reparations? I'm going to give everybody $1,000, motherfuckers.
The median African-American household net worth is projected to be 0 by 2053. Things are not getting better for people of color. If anything, they're getting...
Whoa, that's a crazy statistic. Haven't heard that one before.
Andrew Yang just freaking pulling him out.
Yo, that is fucked.
Worse because we're in the process of eliminating the most common jobs in our economy. It's something of an economic unnatural disaster. And who suffers most in a natural disaster? People of color, people with lower levels of capital and access to opportunity and education. And while I know we love to...
Yeah, absolutely, because honestly, people of color are one of the main, I would say, I don't know if this is what he was getting at, but like black people, it's all or nothing. It's kind of like, oh, they're the athletes. They're the superstar athletes of the whole world, or just criminals and super predators. So he's saying middle income people in that demographic is going to be hitting 0 by 2050. And that's very interesting to think about because it doesn't seem too far-fetched when you think about the way that things go right now. It's either super, super poor or holy shit, I just signed a record deal, motherfucker suck my dick. You know? Like, that shit, not creating a very wide net for people to succeed under. And sad. Shouts out to Yang, again, one more time. Speaking truth to the power, and for sure.
champion education here as Democrats. Only 33% of Americans are going to attend college. Lower percentage of African Americans. There is no way we can prevent this tsunami from wiping out African American net worth unless we put straight cash into their hands sometime between now and 2053. And it's not just them. It is truck drivers, it is retail clerks, it is call center workers, it is accountants, it is bookkeepers. We are in the midst of the greatest economic transformation in the history of our.
And he just described to you guys, if you missed it, he just described to you a bunch of occupations that like very easily are going to be taken over by robots soon.
Yeah. Well,
so that's what he didn't say it, but that's his main thing.
Those are also jobs that don't necessarily pay as much as a college graduate, right? So I think when he's tying it to race, he's tying it to the fact that, you know, African Americans, once they're poor, it's a cycle of poor, right? Like, yes, historical racism has created this terrible like cycle where because they can't get a college education, they can't make enough money to send their kids to college without debt. And then because their kids can't get into college without debt, those kids cannot buy a house, so they don't have money to pass on to their kids to get into college without debt, right? There's this like endless cycle, and like one of the only ways to break that is cold hard cash. It allows these people to get into college and not have those high debt levels.